Okay, we are good to go. So we will jump right in. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining. We're going to be doing the board deep dive, setting and monitoring progress towards the North Star goal. And again, I'm very happy to have Bill Stubblefield join me in this presentation today. And the presentation is really structured to be more of a facilitation of a conversation among everyone. And so feel free to drop anything in the chat. Michael and I will watch that, and Bill will watch that if there's things that we can respond to. But also would love for everyone to just engage in the conversation that we will have about how a board really does monitor and set this progress towards the North Star goal, which is just critical. Next slide, please. So I worked for a superintendent one time that would share this, and I just thought it's such a important statement. And then I realized over time, in my 11 years as a superintendent, and then as also on several nonprofit boards and on just boards in general, how important this is and how it really comes to full vision. That is, absent a goal, everything is negotiable. So absent having a clear direction, a clear focus, having the discipline to stick to that clear focus, everything's negotiable. And we've all worked in areas, we've all worked in organizations where we felt this. When there wasn't a clear direction, a clear North Star goal where we were heading to, we've all felt what that negotiation is like and how messy it is, and really how it does not allow for progress and for the organization to really move forward. And so I love the fact that part of the SGS system is establishing that North Star goal, because I think that's so important. I remember being a middle school principal, and there was an elementary school principal who's the campus fed into the campus I was leading, and she was real frustrated with the parents because they kept wanting to bring to her different reading programs to institute at the school. And I said to her one day, "So what is your reading approach? What is your reading program?" And she goes, "I don't have one." And I'm like, not having that clear direction then creates an overall negotiation of what should be happening, a constant negotiation of what should be happening within the system. And that's why I think this work around setting a North Star goal is so important. And again, what we'll focus on a lot of today is how does the board actually monitor to make sure the system is moving that direction? Next slide, please. So we're going to start with this, and Michael's going to pull up a poll. I love polls on Zoom because they're anonymous. Like, everyone can really give their true kind of feeling about what they're thinking about. And so what I'd love for everyone to do is, if you're in the district, or if you're working with the district, a board member, again, a lot of the way I've structured, and Bill and I have structured this today, is really the board member perspective, but love everyone to engage. And what I'd like you to do first is just answer this poll about what is your North Star goal. So Michael's going to pull up the poll, and then he will share some results with us.
So we'll go ahead and give about 10, 15 seconds for you to answer the poll, and then we'll report out what the answers are. So we have about a third of people are saying, yes, they know their North Star goal exactly as it's written. Another third that are saying, yes, to some extent, I know that we have a goal, and I could tell people about it in general terms. 3 people, it's 12%, say that maybe they might have a North Star goal. And 20% of people say, no, we don't have a North Star goal.
Great, thanks for sharing, Michael. So this is very interesting, right? So I teach college courses to people becoming superintendents or people who want to become principals. And I tend to ask that question in their own systems. What are the goals of your system? And it's really interesting how in about 90% of the case, they really cannot articulate the goals of the systems that they're part of. And so, this idea of setting goals, but also internalizing goals. And as we know in organizations, and large organizations, and school districts are large organizations, it's very hard to internalize these at times, to really get them embedded throughout the system. And so I really appreciate that sharing, because it looks like a third felt like, hey, I know exactly what it is, I can articulate it. A third, to some extent, probably could paraphrase the goals or the North Star goal of their system. 12%, maybe, I think we should have it and we might have it, which means you probably don't know if you actually have it. And then 20% saying we don't have it. Now, remember, the new districts to SGS would not have this right now. That's something that the 3 districts that have been added to SGS this year will add over this year. But then there are probably some that are in districts who have been in who really, you haven't moved to that stage of really having a North Star goal. So one thing that Michael did for me is collect all the North Star goals of districts currently in the network that have a North Star goal. And we want to share that with you. And Michael will do that on the next slide. So these are the goals that are out there right now. These are the districts who've established goals, North Star goals. And so I'm just going to give you a little chance just to kind of read through them so you can kind of see, you know, I always think it's great to share what others are doing. It may give you ideas that how you want to tweak yours. It may give the new districts or districts that do not have one, how they would want to write it. But you can see Aldine has by 2025, 50% will be in A and B schools. Beaumont by 2024, they want to increase their A and B schools from 2 to 8. Cross, so you know, Aldine's looked at overall percentage. Beaumont has looked at a number of schools. Crowley says by 2025, 100%. Fort Worth has kind of broken it into different type of areas because they've, you know, districts in SGS in your own portfolio, you'll be tiering schools, so they've defined it into tiers. Longview says all schools at least a B or better by 23. Lubbock by 24, 80% of students will serve in quality schools, A or B. Maynard, 86.6, an A or B. 2025 in San Antonio, 70%. And in Victoria, you can see by 2024, increase the number of students in A and B schools, and then increase the number of schools. So they broke it out into both, not only, you know, the number of students, but also the number of schools. So this is just an indication of the goals that are out there now. And there are some districts that are currently in the network who still are working to establish their goal. And then the 3 districts that have been added, this is some of the key work you'll do early on in your SGS work, is defining your North Star goal for your SGS work and being part of the SGS network as we move forward. Any questions anyone has about any of these goals before we move on and kind of start talking about not only the goals, but how you monitor these goals? Any questions anyone would like to pose? You can put them in chat or you can do it. Michael, I think they have access to being able to do it live, correct? So any questions about these goals? Any questions or comments?
You can take yourself off mute and speak up, or you could drop your comments in the chat, either way.
That's great. So Liz is asking, I'm curious how districts are monitoring progress in absence of letter grades. I think when we get into the monitoring, we may address that a little further. But I know this has been a very difficult piece, right? Without the, you know, really our only new data was in 2019. We'll now have new data this year. We won't have letter grades. You know, so how do we, you know, how do we actually gauge what, if most of these are being defined as A and B schools as quality, how do we go about and do that? And so I'd love for anyone who is with the districts who are trying to figure that out now, is how are you gauging towards this goal this year without letter grades being issued? You can put it in chat or you can share it out loud if you want to. To measure this year without letter grades? I see Lubbock is saying, Kathy thinks you're going to use your district assessment data as well as iStation and Dreambox data. And then Patty mentioned that the SGS goal is backed by 5-year goals developed by the board and the superintendent. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, how we combine all this together. Well, good. And I think hopefully Alyssa will answer that question a little clearer as we go through the rest of the presentation today. Next slide. So here's a question. We want to go into breakout rooms and talk about this a little bit because I think it's really important. I remember when I came to Spring Branch in 1996 as a middle school principal, we had the board had goals, the district improvement team had goals. By the way, you can tell the district improvement team was just like, can we satisfy everyone? Because they had like 25 goals of their own. The superintendent had a set of goals the board had for the superintendent. And my question as a principal in the system is, what was that really supposed to pay attention to? What was really important to the system? There was just too much in too many places. And so what I'd love to do is we're going to break out into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes for you to share how does this SGS North Star goal fit into your Lone Star governance goals and any other goals you have in your system. So you know, in your breakout groups, talk about number one, how are they arranged right now in your system? Do you have Lone Star government goals are here, SGS goals here, we have some other goals in our system. Are they all together? Just how and how you see all of this fitting together as you move forward in establishing goals within your system? How do you see the North Star goal, Lone Star governance goals, and your own goals for your system if you have them? How do you see that fitting all together and how do you deal with that now? So Michael's going to move into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes to talk about this, and then we'll come back and I'd like you to share a little bit about what you talked about in your breakout room.
So you should see in just a second a prompt that the breakout rooms are opening.
But I'd love some sharing out kind of what you discussed in your breakout rooms. You know, how do you take this North Star goal? How do you fit it in with the Lone Star governance goal requirements? And then any system goals you have. Are you keeping them separate? Or are you trying to incorporate them all together? Would love just your feedback on how you're approaching aligning all these in the system to make it really clear what the expected outcomes are of the system. So would love any sharing from the group.
Duncan, this is Kathy
Hey, Kathy.
How are you?
Good, good.
Good. We shared, first of all, we were the only district that has been in SGS and had actually had the time to set those goals. So we want to welcome Seguin and Grand Prairie. They were in our group as well and are new and excited to get started with the work. We set our Lone Star governance goals 2 years ago, pre-pandemic. But our North Star goal that at least 80% of our students will be educated in an A or B campus is really our umbrella goal. It is the one that is the most important. But then underneath that goal, we have very specific targeted achievement goals and outcome goals for students. But all of those are aligned and are related to our overarching goal of our North Star goal.
Okay, Kathy, I really like that concept. Like you took that as your really driver, right? Instead of lining it into just another goal, because I'm going to show you an example in a second where it's lined in. But I love the fact that you said, hey, that's really our overarching, and then it sounds like your Lone Star governance and any other metrics set underneath that umbrella of your SGS goal, your North Star SGS goal.
Yes, thanks, and it's worked really well for us.
Great perspective. I really love that perspective. Other feedback from the breakouts, how districts are handling this or how they're thinking about handling the fact that you have multiple goals that you're working with in your system.
Well, I could share from San Antonio. Am I on? Do people hear me?
Yeah, hey, thanks.
Oh, okay, all right. So yeah, so our from our overarching goal, we do have we have that broken down, but overall, and I put a message in the chat that as we go into our 21-22 school year, we're actually, looking at the goals that we had in 2019 and 2020 of our 5-year goal to get going and, and get towards that overarching goal. But when the pandemic hit, we couldn't really measure. We felt like we were just going, along very, very well. And our MAP scores in the fall showed that we were doing very well. But then we couldn't prove it by the end of the year because of COVID. And then, of course, with all the loss that has happened in the last 16 months, we're looking at setting as our first year goal that those goals that we had in the 1920 school year. And we do have specifics under the overall goal to increase students attending high quality schools, and of course reaching that 70% in A and B schools by 2025. And I can share whatever detail you want, but that's where.
I think that's great. I think that gives us a really good perspective of how you, as a system, have managed these different expectations and really brought them together, to create a focus within the system. I really appreciate that. Rodney, would you like to share? I thought you had a great perspective as a new district going in. I think you've already been thinking about how this fits in with where you are in your strategic planning process. Would you mind sharing that with the group?
Sure. So we just completed our 5-year strategic plan. We're going to be rolling out our new one in August. So our board has already established Lone Star governance goals, and so we're looking at our North Star goal as the main goal for the district, and there's different more or less outputs that we'll be looking at to make sure that we're working towards that one goal. And so we're looking at really using the North Star goal as the umbrella for the #1 priority, and then there's different things that we'll do throughout the 5-year plan to get us there.
That's great. Yeah, and we were talking, our session, Rodney was in the breakout room, and kind of a really nice place to be when you start your SGS work is if your strategic planning process and entry into the program, the network, is at the same time. You have this ability to kind of bring it all together. As those of you who have been in the network for a while know, sometimes you're at the beginning of a new, like 1 or 2 years into a plan, and you really want to stay true to that plan, and then you need to incorporate the SGS work in, or you may be in year 4 and needing 1 or 2 more years of your current plan. So it's just a great, I think it's a great spot to be in when you're kind of finishing your strategic planning process for the future, and you can incorporate all this together. Kathy, I see you posted, we're all set pre-pandemic, and the board will meet for team building on the 29th, and we'll revisit our goals anyway, which I think is critical, right? It's like, this is I work with different entities and say it's a reset. It's like you almost have to see 2020 as a baseline year, and 2021 as a baseline year and a reset year, because it was such a disruptive time. And I don't know, there's ability to use your 19 data and your 21 data to gauge kind of the effect, but it's almost like you set 21 as a baseline year and then just really focus on growth for the future. Other feedback from breakout groups about how districts are thinking about handling these different expectations, an SGS North Star goal, Lone Star governance goals, and any goals you have within your system. Any other sharing? Okay, we'll move on. And again, if you're having audio, some of you are having audio problems. I know, Star, I'm doing the same thing you are. I tend to have to go out and in for it to allow me to have all the audio functions. So just if you are having problems with your audio, feel free to put anything in the chat that you would like to put in the chat. We'll go to the next slide.
Just one thing.
I just wanted to show you an example of one of the districts that we work with. This is Victoria ISD. We were very fortunate that we were able to help facilitate their strategic planning process and the SGS work. We had that opportunity also in Beaumont, and we will actually be taking that opportunity in Galveston this year, which is a nice place to be because, again, you can incorporate this all together. And so when Victoria articulates the goals of their new strategic plan, they're just all put together as we have 6 goals, and they articulate the 3 House Bill 3 goals that they're required to have. They articulate their what I call kind of local goals, goal 4 and 5, which came out of their strategic planning process. And then goal 6 is their loans or their system of great schools, their North Star goal. So, you know, when the community sees it, when the whole team inside Victoria sees it, they just see it as we have 6 goals that we're focusing on as a system. They don't, you know, it's not, you know, for the viewer of this, do they need to know what all the breakout is? I don't think they do. They just need to know that these are the important focus points of the district moving forward. And it meets all the requirements of the Lone Star Goals system. It meets the requirements of SGS, and it incorporates then some local context. And you can see the 2 local contexts I think are very interesting and very localized. The ISD will increase the number of students to achieve their and, like what happens after high school, from 75.15 to 85% by 2024. And their and is defined as number of students who complete high school with technical certification, enlistment in the military, enrollment technical school, community college, or university. So the and, like what happens after college or after high school graduation. And then very important to them through their strategic planning process, through a visioning process that they went through, is they really wanted to, they're influenced greatly by John Tanner's work, and they really wanted to look at a community-based accountability system and how they incorporate that together. And so they wrote a goal in that area also. So this is just what it looks like in one district. It can look completely different in many districts. I love Kathy's idea, this umbrella. My last 4 or 5 years in Spring Branch, we had an overarching one single focus goal. And it was to double the number of kids in Spring Branch who completed some form of higher education. We defined higher education as technical, military 2 and 4. And then we had key data points inside that. And so I love this, the different concepts. I think the key here, the key thing that you're trying to achieve is focus and discipline, right? You know, not that situation that happened when I came to Spring Branch from Spring ISD, Rodney, in 1996, and as a middle school principal. And I didn't know what was important to the system because there were so many goals floating around. As a middle school principal, I didn't know exactly what the system really wanted us to produce as outcomes. And I think this type of focus and discipline really helps drive organizations forward. Next slide. So the question here then is, now that we have this conversation, what are the goals or how the goals are formed, and we know we need a North Star goal for SGS, then how do you monitor your district's progress towards meeting the goals of your school system? And next slide, please. We're fortunate today to have Bill Stubblefield, the Vice President of the Board in Lubbock. Again, Lubbock has really done great work in aligning the work of SGS into their system. I think when you hear Kathy as a superintendent say, it became our overarching goal, that means it became the focus, the key focus of the system, is just a great example of that. And Bill's going to share from a board member's perspective what it's been like as a board member to monitor the district's progress towards that overarching goal. Bill?
Thank you, Duncan, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for the robust crowd that's joining us today. We're happy to have you, and it's an exciting time to be part of the SGS work and everything that we're doing here in Lubbock ISD. And I'm sure that post-pandemic, everybody's sort of wiping the sweat from their brow and ready to get truly engaged in this phenomenal work. It's been a journey, and I love what the commissioner said. It's not so much as the destination, but the journey on how we get there. And this journey has been filled with a lot of waves where we've been tossed to and fro, but yet we stay the course. As far as determining our outcomes and what we're going to do with our North Star goal, I just see us as a conduit or a surge protector, if you will. I love Kathy's analogy about the umbrella. I like the analogy of a surge protector where every other goal and every other driving force in the district, it's plugged into it. And as long as the power is supplied, then everything else is going to be turned on well and running efficiently. We monitor our progress annually. We review the goals during our board workshop meetings, and we have a very involved and engaged board where every member here is dedicated and committed to the success, not just of the districts which they represent, but the overall district as a whole. So although we monitor annually, each one of our board members takes the time to really come and meet with the cabinet, with the team, the superintendents, associates, and what have you, curriculum and instruction and professional development. And we sit down and we talk to those individuals, because one of the things that that the non-negotiables is holding the superintendent accountable to the bold action, to those various constraints throughout the planning process. And we want to make sure we talk to our superintendent. She has an open door policy and regularly communicates with us on how we're doing academically. If we do not get that North Star goal realized and we don't get it obtained, then the other goals sort of fall by the wayside. In the sense of the umbrella, then they get washed out. And in the sense of the power cord, they get unplugged, because without that North Star goal of 80% of our students in quality seats being served in quality campuses, we can't move third graders. We can't move fifth graders. We can't have the and as Victoria has with our kids post-graduation, right? So all of those goals have got to be sheltered and protected and focused. The thread of continuity interwoven into the North Star goal. We are diligent enough to, with the information provided by the district, by Dr. Rollo and her team, we really filter through it and we ask a lot of questions. I would encourage every board member that's participating and every superintendent that's in the session today to have that team concept and that ideology really down, where you really work as a family and understand that the greatest asset that you have are the families that you're serving and the students that you have answered the call to help educate and help them to achieve academically. The collaboration that we have as a board and as a family with the superintendent, and the board training that she mentioned coming up on the 29th for us. We look at those things not as tedious, but as as moments of excitement to grow and to build. As I shared with in our breakout session, one of the things that we challenged Dr. Rollo and her team on is to not sell us on the highlights, right? We're good on the highlight films and on the highlight reels, but we want to know the lowlights. We want to know the areas that aren't working well. Let's see, not neglecting what we're doing well, replicating what we're doing well and what's quality work, and seeing how we can produce it and cause it to multiply in campuses that need it. Because inevitably, if everything is well at the top, then there's some stuff at the bottom that we're missing. So we want to focus on them, keep them on our high performing students, keep them performing at high levels. But let's see how we can take the high performance mindset and put it on the lower level with our lower performing students and get them to where they need to be. And that campus level and campus driven autonomy, which Kathy wholeheartedly embraces, it's working well for us right now. The buy-in from each campus, the buy-in from each team, the buy-in from the community is phenomenal. And coming back to us as board members, our community mindset and approach, the support that every board member has from within their communities is because they are boots on the ground. They really want to get in the weeds, if you will, and do the gardening along with the community. And when you have a community that supports you and supports the work of your district, then the results that you're going to produce, they are going to be exceptional. A spirit of excellence inspires everyone, and it really honors the students that you're serving.
That's great, Bill. I really appreciate that perspective. Just a great perspective. I have a couple of questions, and if anyone else has questions for Bill, I'd love you to either put them in the chat or ask them. But so one thing you mentioned I think is so important. First of all, I love Kathy sharing that, you know, the way she saw this as the CEO of the system, right, is this umbrella approach. How she saw this as just not another thing to do, but she saw it as this is a driver of the system. But you mentioned too, you know, how you work as a team, and you know, from my days either having been on a board, I've been an elected official before in a city, on a city council, or in the superintendent's role. It sounds like the board in Lubbock has also created a safe space for this, right? Like this is and wanting the highlights and the lowlights, because in the reality, if we probably looked at all the board member meetings that happen across the state, most of the presentations we would hear would be the highlight presentations, not the lowlight presentations, right? Like, can we be vulnerable enough to show those things publicly? And what I hear is the board in Lubbock has created a safe space for Kathy and the team to do that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And continuing with Duncan, with the power strip analogy and the from the CEO's perspective, right? Let's take something that we all, well, at least us as Texans know. I don't know if Dr. Geist and her team or you right now have experienced what Texans experienced a few months ago, back up in February, when the power grid went out because of the winter storm, right? So now we've made switches, and now we've held our ERCOT system accountable. Well, when we have power outages within this system, it's not a visceral attack on the CEO. It's how can we help? What do we need to do to check the substations? How can we get out and totally help you? Because we know one thing, that you've been hired by us to do the work, and we know that you have the capacity and the ability to get the job done. We want to take that approach to serving while she's in charge of the inputs and the outputs. We want to be in charge of the outcomes and hold her responsible to making sure that inputs and outputs produce desired outcomes. So we want to get with her and ask, how can we help to create the best possible outcome? You determine what inputs, what resources that you need. You determine how that needs to go and bring them to us so that we can say, hey, we think this works well, or we think that this option is going to work better. When we talk about the collaboration, we understand that every organization's success depends upon its ability to build and maintain effective, sustainable partnerships. If we don't have that cohesiveness and that partnership where our superintendent feels like she can approach us and not be beat down and not be taken to the cross, if you would, then we'll never be able to move the needle in the aspect of the positive results that we're trying to create. We all know at the end of the day that we are working together for what's best for the families and the communities that we serve. We want to know that that financially we're making the most of the resources as good stewards to which the public has entrusted us to. So we know that we've got a superintendent who's an admiral who can help us to navigate through these treacherous waters. We just can't be the ones rocking the boat. And this board, we really stand behind her to help her to get us through.
That's great. You know, and I think you mentioned something that's really important there. So a lot of the sessions about how do you monitor, which is how do you hold the system accountable to not only helping set this North Star goal, but how do you hold the system accountable to meeting the North Star goal? I think what you've described is that accountability doesn't have to be mean. It doesn't have to be punitive, right? I think maybe because our early days, the way we dealt with accountability in the state, it was such a punitive view of accountability. But what you're describing is this process where you still, as a board member, hold the superintendent and the system accountable for outcome, but you do it in a very logical performance management type way, versus a punitive type way. And then recognizing too that Kathy has the responsibility of holding the whole system accountable from her CEO standpoint. So I think it's just a great way to describe that. I'd love to see if anyone has any questions for Bill, any board members or participants in the session. If you want to ask any questions or if you want to post them on the chat, we take any questions for Bill right now before we move on. We'll wait just a second in case anyone's putting anything in the chat at this time. Bill, if one pops up, I'll come back to you, but thank you very much for sharing that. I really appreciate you sharing that experience, because you guys have, in Lubbock, have just done a great job of aligning this work from the board throughout the system. So really thank you for taking the time to share it. Michael, if you can go to the next slide. So, one thing I think about in all my years of either being on a board or being a superintendent or being a staff member is this issue around, how do you go beyond just reports to the board, and how do you really get board engagement in the monitoring process? And so think about that as we go through the rest of this, and we'll have a chance at the end to kind of process through that. But think about, often, we used to say, and I would have to say to staff at times, let's not do a data dump to the board. Like, let's not, it's kind of like if we talk the whole time during the presentation, maybe we won't get the tough questions. And so how do we go beyond this work and with the board engagement, beyond reports to the board, and how do we really get the board engaged in the monitoring process? And again, I think Bill gave a great example of how they hold the system accountable, but they hold the system accountable in a team concept as they move through the process. Next slide, please. So I want to spend a little time, because of my board member perspective too, spend a little time with this concept of how do you make a difference as a board member? Because, here's a really interesting piece, right? Is that people run to be on a school board. First of all, anytime you run for elected office, you're putting yourself out there. And you really do that because you want to have an impact, and you want to have the ability to really have an influence on the system. And I can remember being elected as a city council member one time and sitting behind the dais on my first meeting going, God, I feel like I had more influence sitting in the audience than I do here. I feel so constrained sitting behind the dais and being part of this conversation. I actually felt like I had more influence when I was, outside and or being someone in the audience who could engage with all the board members. And so, how do you really make a difference? And so I want to spend some time talking about that a little bit. Next slide. So there's some major touch points, and board members have been through trainings, required trainings and different trainings about really where are these touch points of making a difference. And they're fairly narrow for boards, but they're very impactful if they're done really well. The major touch points are development of the system goals. So if you think about the North Star goal, the Lone Star governance goals, the overall goals of the system, the board has the ability to be part of that process and has really the final stamp on what are the goals of the system. The selection and evaluation of the system leader, critical piece, picking the best CEO to run that system, and then putting in this mechanism to operate as a team in support of them, but also hold them accountable. You have this approval of the system budget, and how are you allocating resources in according to the direction you want to take the system? A really hard thing to do, by the way, a really hard piece to, number one, understand the complexities of a large governmental budget, but also the inertia of the system to continue funding what's always been funded versus adjusting that funding to really where the priorities of the system are. You have the ability to develop policy. And, to be honest with you, I think sometimes board members do not understand the power of this piece, right? Of a policy side, because you have a huge influence of the system and operating from policy. Often you get your TASB updates, you read your updates, you approve your updates, and you move on. But in the reality is one place a board member has the ability to really influence the way the system operates is by the policies that are put in place. I remember one time in Spring Branch, we had an intense discussion over homework policy. And it was a major shift in the system of how the system approached teaching and learning, particularly from the standpoint of homework. And the way that the board member who really wanted to focus on that did it was by focusing on the policy around homework in our local policies. That created the conversation, created the debate, and resulted in a new policy moving forward. So this development policy is a critical area for a touch point for a board. And then monitoring, I think this is really critical, monitoring the effectiveness of the board. Some boards do a really good job of this, some don't really do it at all, to be honest with you. So you have the ability to decide, the board really has the ability to decide how the board wants to operate as a board. Often when you come into a board member role, you're coming into a system that has just been doing it that way for years. And so it's this kind of, urban legend of how to continue operating as a board. But I was fortunate to work for a board that really examined the way they operate. Number one, they went away from committees because they felt like committees weren't effective, and because they ended up being a committee of the whole every time a committee met. So that just meant a bunch of additional board meetings. And they went away from that system. They totally restructured their agenda. They totally restructured what went on the agenda and how it went on the agenda, and really took so that they could create this dynamic where they were really spending their time on what they thought was important to the system, not where some system of approach of the agenda and the running of a meetings had been created 20 years before and didn't really fit the day and age of today. And then monitoring their own performance, doing those self-assessments and monitoring their performance. So these are the kind of these board touch points of how you really affect the running of the system and the running of the board. Next slide, please. So I want to share this concept and this thought process between oversight and micromanagement, because I think it's a tricky piece. Those of you who've been through CRSS training know there's this issue between the line where the line where governance is and the line where running the system is, and operations and the superintendent. And Don McAdams, who came up with that system, will really talk about you're not supposed to cross the line. It was great. All of our board members had been through CRSS training I had, and I loved it because every time once we went through it, they'd cross the line, but they'd call me up and they'd say at the beginning of the call, "I'm getting ready to cross the line," and then we'd have the conversation. But there's this really piece of, as a board member, how do you deal with oversight versus micromanagement? But ultimately, you're the leadership organization, the board is, that's responsible for the running of the system, ultimately. The ultimate responsibility falls on you as the elected officials, where you've selected the best CEO to run the system, but ultimately the accountability is to you as a board member. And how do you balance this between oversight and micromanagement? And where does it go from oversight into micromanagement? I want to share two examples in the corporate world that I think are just really great examples to study as a board member, and how you deal with your responsibilities as a board member. Next slide, please. So these two examples are really interesting. So I don't know how much you know about each of these, but you probably have heard some of each one. But you've got a Boeing example and you have a Wells Fargo example. And I actually have friends who are on the board of Boeing and of Wells Fargo. And so I know their quality of individuals. I've known them for a long time, and I know the quality they are. And they were incredible corporate leaders. And then they ended up on these boards. And let's examine what happened in each case. Boeing, the MAX 737 MAX, and this issue of where Boeing had been about safety and the culture of safety for so long, and shifted into a cost-cutting culture, and now had a major issue with the 737 MAX that has really affected the performance of the company. On Wells Fargo, very interesting story from about 5 to 7 years ago, where they put in an incentive plan that people were raving about of how well it was doing for Wells Fargo. But what they realized under an investigation is they had thousands of employees who were opening fake accounts for clients because that was meeting their metric for their incentive system. And so they would basically open fake accounts under clients' names without the client knowing about them, without the bank customer knowing about them, to get credit for opening new accounts to meet their incentives. And it almost destroyed what has been one of the most stable financial institutions in our country, Wells Fargo. And the question is, how did the board members not know this? Or had the board members let it get to this position? And so, next slide, please. There's always this question about, as a board member, how do you really know if the system is moving in the right directions? And how do you hold the system accountable? And how do you ask the right questions? And how do you do your due diligence to the public that's elected you for those positions? And how do you serve in your fiduciary responsibility for your oversight of the system? So I would love to have some board members who are on the session today, either in the chat or out loud, kind of share, as you sit in that seat, how do you process through knowing if the system is heading in the right direction? So we'd love to have some board members. I think it would really help us process through this if you're willing to share either in the chat or if you're able to share, if your audio is working. I would love, or Bill, if you want to jump in first and talk about that. But as a board member, I sit on several nonprofits boards. How do I really know if they're moving in the right direction, if they're handling all the financial resources appropriately? How do I know if the system's really heading in the right direction? So I'd love board members to share kind of your experience and just how you do that as a board member.
Yeah, Duncan, I'll jump in and just start out, and hopefully we can create the dialogue in this conversation, because this is rich and robust conversation to have. I think for me personally, the first thing that really jumps out to let me know that things are working is the community. As we're elected officials from the community in which we serve and represent, when those results start producing within that community, the community is going to celebrate the outcomes. If your community is not celebrating what you're doing, then you're probably not doing what your community needs you to do. A true good board is going to align its goals with the needs in the community. The community is going to have a voice. The community is going to have input. The community also becomes a driving force behind your policy, behind your decision making. When you have disparities and inequities that exist, when the community starts seeing those things go away, you're going to hear the language, and those that are advocating for change, they, rather than being adversaries, they become allies. You will see that your community will celebrate when the board, especially when it's school boards. I tend to think that the value of a school board member is underappreciated and is under-recognized when we compare to council persons and other major boards that exist, because everybody has their children in school. And so when those changes happen in the school that those students are in, the kids are going to celebrate, PTAs are going to celebrate, teacher organizations are going to celebrate. The feedback will be there. We tend to monitor our board. Again, we're so engaged and I respect the conversation about how boards need to change if things aren't working for them. The committee structure works well for us. Our North Star goal is a part of almost every committee, every conversation. How are we putting students in quality seats? And you better believe those parents will celebrate when their kids, when they see academic performance rising. So for me as a board member, I think the progress is truly monitored by the community that you serve when you're elected to do that. So just keep your ear to the ground on what your community is going to celebrate you or they are going to dismiss you.
That's great, Bill. I really appreciate that. And the fact that the community or the committee structure works for you guys really well. I think it's also good. I think our board recognized that there was a lack of trust among board members, and that broke down the committee structure. And what I sense in the Lubbock example, you all have a high level of trust in each other and in the superintendent. And that's something we had to recreate in Spring Branch at the time. And it sounds like that's something you have now. And I think that trust factor is such a critical factor. Okay, I'd love to hear other board members' perspective on just how do you know when things are heading in the right direction? How do you not end up in that Boeing Wells Fargo world so that because what happens when those things happen, and we've all worked in systems where they've happened at times, what the community says is, how did you not know that as a board member? So how do you know the system? Bill just gave a great example of knowing how it's moving in the right direction in Lubbock. Would love to hear for a couple other board members just how you know it's moving in the right direction, if you're willing to share out to the group.
Well, I know I've spoken before, so I sort of sitting quietly, maybe giving space for someone else to speak up. But this is Patty Radel from San Antonio Independent School District. And, when we were talking a while ago about goals, I also wanted to share that while we put together our 5-year goals, our superintendent went to every department and got every department to set their goals aligned with our goals. And then also asked them to set a calendar because we were asking for feedback. We wanted to know how's it going, which we did not do with our first set of our 5-year goals. With this new set, we're saying we want to know how things are progressing. So departments are building in or reporting on that. But other questions that we ask are, how do all these goals align with the budget? We just passed our budget last night, and we had a lot of questions in our work sessions and all to know how things are lining up with our budget. And I think relating to some of the things that Bill said, remembering that we are connected to our community and to find places for the voice of the parents and the variety of staff that we have, whether it's the teachers and support staff, the nurses, the bus drivers. And I do try to visit campuses or visit departments. And I always, just simply ask the question, how's it going? And get a little feedback. I always feel like I'm a better board member when I have visited a campus and have asked questions. And I go around and visit each of the principals in my single member district every year. And my question to them is, what can you tell me that will help me to be a better board member? I said, I'm not here to inspect. I'm here for you to tell me what I need to do better and to have your voice and to be able to be in touch with your concerns. Another thing is that we do have the subcommittee. So we have board members meeting with staff. They are not, they're simply advisory, but they help us get through the mounds of material that we need to make good decisions and then give us some feedback at the full board meetings. So those are just a few thoughts that I share. Again, to me, it is so important to be in touch with the community and create your own opportunities to be in touch with parents or students to get feedback, along with attending those events at campuses where you have a chance to ask that question, how are things going for you? What do we need to do? Thank you.
Yeah, Patty, I love that. And I love the comment or the question you asked when you go out to campuses where the focus is, how can I be a better board member? I just think that's a great, introspective kind of question to ask. And I just think I've not heard that before. But often board members will ask, what do you need? And that's like Well, you ask a principal or teacher what they need, and there's going to be a laundry list, right? And so I love asking the questions, how can I be a better board member from the campus perspective? I think that's a great question. Any other comments or input on this piece from one of the board members in the session? I'm gonna go ahead and start moving through. I want to get to a couple of other pieces. And so we're gonna move and we're gonna shift a little bit from board members into the next kind of question to pose. And that is, what is the superintendent's role in creating meaning in the board member role? I think the superintendency, and I think those, Kathy and Rodney and others who are on would acknowledge, probably when we start our careers, our first year teaching, the superintendent role was real different in those years. And when I started teaching, you were starting to have this end of the 20, 25, 30-year superintendent, 35-year superintendent in some systems, and much greater turnover superintendents. And I think, and I saw individuals who kind of had their career during that change really struggle with that change. And I always felt like it changed from, the superintendent being the ultimate leader of the system to really the superintendent as more of a facilitator of running the system and the facilitator of the work of the board. And so I always felt like I had, and particularly after having sat on a city council where I was like, okay, how do I really have an impact? I put myself out there, I won an election, how do I have an impact? I always viewed my role as a superintendent to help create some meaning in the board member role. Create that role so that role really felt impactful and part of the system of decision-making within the overall system. So I would love, just from a superintendent perspective, any of you that are on the session today to share kind of how you view that as you go through and plan how the system is operated as the person running the system, but also the person responsible for the relationship directly to the board, how in your role you create this meaning in the board member role.
Duncan, this is Kathy. I would be happy to share just a little bit. I've been in this role a little over 3 years, and I think Bill has certainly addressed how collectively our board has worked together to establish our North Star goal and how the board collectively monitors. But one of the things I did early on, and I continue to do as we have new board members join our team, is I've met individually with board members quite a bit to find out, what is their why. They are giving a lot of time, a lot of mental energy to this work, but there's something that has to be there to drive that. And so I think finding out individual board members' goals and purposes for serving in this role is really important as a superintendent. And then I also really try to empower board members to ask the tough questions of our team. And they're not afraid to do that. Anyone from Lubbock ISD on this call would tell you that our board members ask us really tough questions. But we can also almost guess which questions each one of them will ask based on their whys. So I think making sure that you establish an environment where your team, our Lubbock ISD team, is not afraid to answer those questions, and empowering board members to feel comfortable asking those questions, and then really understanding what drives each board member and helping make sure that why, that need is being met for each of them is really important to this role.
That's great, Kathy. I really appreciate that perspective. And again, I can just sense this. It makes me want to spend some time in Lubbock. I can just sense this very openness. In a lot of the writing around Good to Great and others, one thing they say is that high-performing organizations are brutally honest with themselves. And I think it sounds like in Lubbock, you guys have created the opportunity to be brutally honest. And that's just a really important place to be. Are there any other perspectives from superintendents who are on the session today, just how you see your role in creating meaning in the board member role?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely a unique relationship. Next month, I'm going into my 8th year here in spring. And It really is give and take. I mean, we are a team of 8. It's really understanding what our roles are, but being open to reciprocal conversations. It's important to remember that they are elected officials. They do represent the community and not themselves, in and of themselves. And so within that conversation comes a sense of transparency. I've been overly transparent with our board, and really making sure that they have a firm understanding of all of the pieces that goes within their roles, but then also giving them some backdrop information as to what my role is as well. And so it's definitely keeping the conversations first and foremost, and meeting with them on a regular basis, and developing relationships with them around the vision about what it is that we're hoping to accomplish here within the district.
That's great, Ronnie. I really appreciate that. And I always tell people that the superintendency to me felt much like the principalship. It felt the same, except there were 7. It was larger, and there were 7. I had 7 bosses. And so I always felt like, because you're kind of setting the agenda. You feel like you do when you're running a campus. It was just a larger perspective, and it's very different to have 7 bosses. That's a very different perspective. I'm going to kind of move through. I just want to share, next slide, a couple of pieces of just thoughts of this area of the superintendents. Clearly, I think where the engagement can happen here is in the communication structure set up between the superintendent and the board. Some of those are on a weekly basis. Everyone has different structures. I know I called every board member on meeting day just to have a conversation. Usually, that was started out to really have a conversation about the agenda. And it really turned in their opportunity just to have a direct conversation with me about many things in the system. So this whole communication structure, I can't tell you enough how important the agenda development process is, and how there's an opportunity around that piece to use the agenda development process, and then just the overall decision-making process and how you incorporate all the work together. Next slide. I want to focus now very briefly on the CIO's role, because several CIOs are in the session, and what is their role in creating this dynamic with the board, and making sure that the board is engaged in this monitoring process of the North Star goal. Next slide. So a couple of thought pieces here. First of all, we need to all acknowledge a CIO role is a very challenging role. In our traditional systems, people really struggle with any type of system that is different than the standard system out there, or different than the standard position out there. And so it's a very challenging role to really be in the CIO role. They're an intermediary. They're kind of between people and negotiating and helping the system, and particularly between innovative schools and central offices that are not set up to support innovative schools. And then they have to have influence without any direct authority. So a very difficult place to be in. And really the project managers that drive the SGS system. So to me, the role of the CIO is really making sure they're incorporating the process of the board in this overall process of running the system, and the overall process of the board being engaged in monitoring the progress towards a North Star goal. Next slide. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to move fairly quickly through these last slides, but just want to show you some things. There are several things that are built into SGS that are perfect for monitoring the progress, and the board being involved in monitoring the progress towards a North Star goal. Next slide. So here are the components in SGS that if you're a new district, you're going to be learning about. If you're a current district, you're working on, but they're great touch points for the board. The quality seats analysis, this analysis we do every year as part of the annual portfolio planning process to really look at where are we in quality seats, and how are we moving? Are we progressing to having more quality seats and less low quality seats in our system? Each year, you're to put together a strategic school action plan where you really designate what is your plan for every campus in that system moving forward in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You have a community engagement plan, which is part of the SGS work, where you're really gauging, and it's somewhat narrow. I mean, it can be broader, but ultimately what you want to know from your community engagement plan in SGS is what types of options would parents really like to see? I know in Victoria, they asked through Thought Exchange, would people like choice? And there was like 74% said, yes, we want more choice. We would like to have choice. And then it's really in the community engagement, figuring out what type of choices they would like to have. Again, a great touch point for a board of trustees. In the SGS work, you're to have a senior leadership team and board engagement plan. And so again, a great place for their touch point for a board. And then there's supposed to be this whole analysis of your policies around authorizing and equitable enrollment. And so a great policy review, engaging the board in that area is another component where you can have a touch point in SGS. I want to just briefly show you what an overall annual portfolio planning process looks like with board engagement in it, and an example from Beaumont. So next slide. If you can go ahead, next slide. So this is the overall annual planning process that Beaumont and Victoria uses. And we'll be doing in Galveston, then we'll be instituting it in Seguin, working with Seguin this year. But just this overall annual plan starting in August around the quality seats analysis, the community input, evaluating options, putting in October a strategic action plan, school action plan together, and then looking at any things like 1882 agreements or school action fund decisions coming out of that planning process. Next slide. This is just a 5-step process that we use in those districts where basically we review the QSA and the North Star goal. We come up with a strategy in step 2. All the campuses are tiered in their system based on the data from the quality seats analysis. And then in step 4, actions are applied to every campus. And by the way, that action may be, we have the best principal in the world. What are we going to do to keep them there as long as we can? And step 5 is pulling it all together into annual plan. And so this is just a process where there can clearly be touch points for the board and the senior team and the leadership team as you go through that process. I'm going to kind of just briefly show these, Michael, as we go through. Next slide. This is what these 5 steps look like. This is what hey, in SGS, let me tell you something. What you're supposed to do is learn from the best. And we saw what Lubbock was doing. We learned from the best. And so we use this example in every district where they customize this to their own dynamics, but it's a great graphic to show you how you move, in this case, Beaumont, from 2 to 8, what their plan is to move from 2 to 8. Next slide. This is just kind of how the schools are listed in their performance and the strategy. Next slide. This is a part where the district went through a process to tier all their campuses. And they created 4 tiers, which I love because they created a tier called urgent, like we have to move and we have to move fast on these schools. Next slide. Again, they then align possible actions to every tier. Next slide. And again, redefining those actions and align to each tier. Next slide. And then came up with a process to assign a school action to every campus based on their performance. Next slide. And it ended up in an overall strategic plan where every campus is listed, the performance is designated, and every campus has a strategic school action that we'll review annually and change based on the dynamic of new data that we have in the new quality seats analysis. So this is just an example. And by the way, we'll have access, Michael, they'll have access to the PowerPoint at some point, correctly? And it will have all this information in it. Also, we'll have an appendix in it that has the Beaumont quality seats analysis that they used last year that they'll build on this year as we go through the process again. Next slide. I want to be respectful of your time, but I want to leave you with this. Again, absent a clear goal, absent a clear focus, a clear direction, the discipline to stay focused on a clear goal, everything is negotiable. And when we're in those situations where everything's negotiable, it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like we're moving in the right direction. And that's why setting this North Star goal, setting this focus, and then setting a system up for the board to be engaged and holding the system accountable to it is just critical in this SGS work. Any final questions or comments that anyone would like to bring up before we end today's session? I really want to thank Bill. I want to thank the Lubbock team. I want to thank everyone who's been on today for sharing. I know we're having some audio issues and some trickiness around the audio system. But I really want to thank everyone for being part of it. And I hope we provide some information today that will help you as you move forward, as superintendents plan this work, as CIOs plan this work, as EAs and technical advisors support districts, and particularly as board members, as you support this work in your district around the system of great schools. Just thank you very much for being part of this and for your commitment to the summit over today and tomorrow, and your commitment to the SGS work. Michael, anything else we need to go over?
No, Duncan, that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just want to thank Michael. He is the whole what those of you new will realize, this DSSI team is incredible. I also want to thank Matthew Frank, who's the co-founder with Diversa Advisors, who helps me out with some of my slides when my technology skills get left behind, and his are much farther ahead of mine. But I really want to thank everyone, and I'm just glad that you're all part of this SGS work moving forward.